Chapter 20. After the Storm. I only knew Erin for a short time. At the time, she seemed so much older. I guess I thought of her as an adult. Looking back, I realized that both Erin and Jess were barely 5 years older than me. Still teenagers, essentially still kids themselves. War and loss took away so much of our childhood. Yet somehow, Jess and Erin didn't just save Tina and me. They saved our childhood, too. We still had to take on responsibilities and tasks that many adults hadn't had just a decade earlier. But they were both young, and they knew how important it was to have fun. I remember smiling more in just a few weeks than I had in nearly a year. David's Journal. Erin closed the tattered, water-stained book with a thump. She had found it in the remains of the town's library. Says here he's got jaundice, that's why he's all yellow. Jess rubbed her eyes, yawned until her jaw cracked, and jiggled the baby against her. He was asleep, and had been asleep for well over 5 hours now, but she was so worried about his lack of appetite and the further yellowing of his skin that she had not been able to sleep. Great, she could hear herself snapping, so what the hell do we do? Erin's satisfied grin turned down at the edges. Well, it says here he needs ultraviolet light, some kind of incubator thingy that they have in hospitals, but the hospital is in ruins, and it probably needs electricity to run it, which we also don't have. Jess felt a wave of despair wash over her. It felt like the whole world was aligned against her. Quincy whined and laid her head on Jess's leg. She had come back before daybreak the morning after the storm, a long scratch on her muzzle, a tiny, limp, dead rabbit in her mouth. She seemed abjectly apologetic for running off the day before. She had barely left Jess's side in the 2 days since and was fascinated by the tiny human her mistress held so close. Jess jiggled Jacob a little more forcefully, desperate to wake him and be sure he ate. It seemed he hadn't eaten much at all since he was born, and she was beginning to be afraid he would just fade away. The sun was out, and it was a beautiful day outside the shed. Tina had fallen asleep in the sun, her half-eaten peach in one hand, and David had returned a few minutes before with fresh water to wash their dishes in. Great, just great, so what do we do now? The lack of sleep was making her nuts. So was the heat and the kids and the... Just put him in the sun. David stood behind them. A bucket of water rested on the ground near his left foot, water still sloshing over one side. Somewhere in the wreckage of his house, he had found shorts, and they were ripped on one side of the waistband. He had also taken off his shoes, and his bare feet were caked with mud. Both of the girls turned and looked at the boy. They looked so confused he thought maybe they hadn't heard him the first time. Just put him in the sun. Not for long, just a little while, a few minutes. They still stared at him and said nothing. You said he needed ultraviolet light, right? Erin nodded slowly. Yes, but... But what? The sun has ultraviolet light. I read it in a book. He looked at them with the disdainful expression only an 11-year-old child can pull off successfully. Erin and Jess continued to gape at him as he shrugged and took the tiny baby from Jess carefully. Like this, he said, speaking to the baby, out here in the sun where it's nice and warm. He gently laid the sleeping baby down and pulled the covers away from the baby's skin. The infant squirmed slightly in his sleep and was still again. But won't he get sunburned? Jess felt stupid asking this of David, who was little more than a small boy in her eyes. David rolled his eyes at her. Of course he will, if you leave him out too long. Just a few minutes at a time. That-a-ways he won't get too much sun, but at least he'll be less yellow. Jess and Erin both looked at each other, and then Erin shrugged. Aw, hell, what can it hurt? And so they tried it, laying the infant out just a few minutes in the sun, wrapping him back up, and then doing it again twice more later in the day. By the end of the next day, he seemed a little more alert, a lot hungrier and far less yellow. Sunlight seemed to have done the trick nicely. But now they found themselves faced with another problem: diapers. Every house they searched came up empty for them. They all felt far from safe in the town, so a fire was out of the question. No fire meant no hot water, and no way to clean themselves or their clothes. Currently, the infant was swaddled in strips of a sheet that had been relatively clean. Aaron knew they would need to move on soon, and that meant supplies and diapers if they could find them. She took David and headed back to the ruined library on the other side of town. It was located in a strip mall near some stores. It looked like ground zero for the firefight they had heard several days ago. The bodies had been left to rot in the hot summer sun. The stench was overpowering as they approached the Big Lots store. 50 yards from that was the collapsed west wall of the library. Aaron pointed David towards the library. "I'll meet you there, but I need to check this out first, okay?" David just nodded and backed away to the safety of the ruined books. Whenever a breeze blew over the bodies, his stomach roiled in protest. He tried to breathe through his mouth so he didn't lose his breakfast. Aaron wrapped a cloth around her mouth and nose, took a few deep breaths, and then entered the Big Lots. She avoided looking down as she stepped over 1, 2, and then a third body near the entrance. She brushed away the flies that swarmed around her and managed to make it down a main aisle before retching into a bin of throw rugs. Baby section, she murmured to herself, trying desperately to not think about the smell or the bodies. She turned right and passed through the clothing and accessories section and took a sharp left. Success! Many of the hooks were empty, but there were layette sets, onesies, tiny socks and hats, a lone pink blanket, and diapers. Holy cow, actual diapers! Aaron forgot about the awful smell from the corpses, ran back to the previous aisle and grabbed large bags to stuff the diapers into. She grabbed every package of diapers. They were all different sizes, but who cared? At least they were better than rags. It took 2 trips to retrieve all of the baby-related items, and she and David lugged the mess back to Jess with triumphant grins. At least now they had something to dress Jacob in. He was tiny, even the newborn sizes hung off of him with room to spare. The next morning, Aaron and David returned to the ruined library. There they rummaged through the collapsed building, tossing books into 2 piles, ones that would help and ones that wouldn't. The system seemed to work pretty well. Many of the books were water-damaged and unusable. Others had no bearing on their hopes for survival. Danielle Steele was definitely on the larger, not helpful pile. Aaron was at one end of the building, looking through what remained of home and garden topics, such as vegetable gardening and a book on how to raise chickens. David had burrowed into one corner and found some books on trails and wilderness camping and survival skills. When the sun was directly overhead, they stopped. Exhausted by the heat, found a tree and sat in the shade of it, and Aaron opened a can of beets she had been avoiding eating until she absolutely had to. David didn't look too impressed with the lunch menu, but he reached in and took a slice of the reddish-purple vegetable. A moment of silence passed, and their hands connected as they both reached into the can at the same moment. David grinned up at her, his lips and teeth stained red, and juice dribbling down his chin. "It isn't too bad, you know." She found herself agreeing. Who would have known that canned beets could taste so good? "What's that you've got?" he asked, pointing to a plain white book she had on the top of her stack of books. Aaron looked over at the book and held it up so the boy could read the title, Wild Edibles of Missouri. Aaron shrugged. "This canned food is catch as catch can. Who knows when we'll have it or when we won't, so I figure we'll supplement with wild plants along the way. Jess and I ate plenty on the way here. Some of it isn't bad tasting at all, but I only know some of the plants, not all of them, so this'll help." David looked stunned at the idea and began to look suspiciously at the greenery surrounding the ruined building. The grass was patchy, mostly weeds and high growth now that summer had come and there was no one left to even care about mowing. "Like what? Do you mean like weeds?" he asked, looking hard at the landscape, as if expecting them to tell him their secrets. Aaron smiled and obliged him by opening up and thumbing through the book. She murmured to herself for a moment and then said, "Dandelion. You can make tea with it, and you can put the leaves into a salad or cook them. And it says that dandelion leaves are very nutritious and is a liver cleanser. We ate them on the way here, but I didn't know about the liver cleansing part of it. She paged to the front of the book, scanned some of the pages, and raised her eyebrows. Huh. Amaranth. Well, I'm sure I've seen that along the way. She turned the book so that David could see a picture of the plant. The blooms were heavy with seed. It says here that you can eat the seeds, shoots, and leaves of the plant. David looked around. Over in one corner, there was a huge clump of dandelions and plenty of other unfamiliar plants he would have previously dismissed as simply being worthless weeds. He smiled. That's cool. Can I read that book too? She grinned back and passed him the book. By the end of the day, they had a decent stack of books on a variety of subjects. It would have taken several trips to bring all of the books they had set aside back, but David led the older girl to a trailer buried in the high grass down the street. It was small, the kind you hitched to the back of a car. It's kind of like a big wheelbarrow, he commented as he dumped an armful of books into it. It had side walls about 1 foot high that held the books with plenty of room to spare. Once they had loaded it up, they each grabbed a part of the chain looped around the handle and headed back towards the hidey hole and shed. Twice on their way back, they saw other people rummaging through the rubble of houses. Aaron looked over at David each time and asked, "Do you know them?" He just shook his head. "Best we keep going then." And they walked on, ignored by the survivors who seemed intent on salvaging any remnant of their lives that they could. Aaron and Jess knew that they had to move on, and discussed it the 5th night following Jacob's birth, as they lay under the bright full moon. David and Tina had retreated to their hidey hole for the night, burrowing underground where they felt safest. "We need to move on," Aaron began. "It isn't safe here." Jess had been dozing with Jacob nestled in the crook of her left arm, steadily nursing at her breast. She murmured sleepily. "It isn't safe anywhere." At the moment, here in their little bed of blankets, under the stars and moon, it felt safe enough. But she lay there and thought about home and became more alert. "We could try and go home. Maybe some managed to escape or hide out." "Maybe." The pause lengthened into minutes as they both lay there staring at the sky. Neither one of them wanted to voice the hope out loud, the persistent niggle in both of their brains that suggested that perhaps some of their family or friends had survived the enemy assault. What if, in just saying it out loud, they jinxed it? Hope was almost a painful weight, a yawning need for normalcy. This past week had been so beautiful, so peaceful after the fierce storm. The sun had shone bright and full each day, the air thick and hot and full of the earthy smells of plants growing and blooming. The earth had continued to turn, despite the chaos in the land, and now the dog days of summer were at their peak. It was hard to believe that it was late August already. If it weren't for the shattered remains of houses all around them, it would have been a normal summer day. Jess spoke first. "We used to camp out in your backyard on nights like this." Aaron smiled in the moonlight. "Remember how Chris and Toby came over and scared us one night? I swear I peed my pants. I was so scared." Jess giggled. They had been about 8 years old, and their older brothers had snuck into the backyard wearing hockey masks. This after all 4 of the kids had watched a horror flick in the basement that night, starring some bad guy named Jason who wore a hockey mask. "Remember how loud I screamed? Your mom and dad thought we were being murdered, and then we were all in trouble for watching that awful movie." They both giggled like little girls at the memory and fell silent, lost in the memories of those that they had lost. Across the night sky, a satellite moved steadily. The Big Dipper was clear and easy to see. Moments passed, and then they both spoke at once. "I miss them so much. Let's go home." A sigh and a deep breath, and Jess spoke again in the silence. "Yeah, let's go home."